Good evening, everyone. This is Paul again, and I am here to review Zero Time Dilemma for the 3DS. Yes, you're not mistaking things. This game is rated M, like its predecessors, for pretty much all the same reasons. And yes, I do plan on tackling this from a Catholic perspective in a later video, but for now, I beat this game about 2 days ago, and I must say, was that a satisfying conclusion. But what about the rest of the game? How does the rest of it hold up? Because the Zero Escape games, for those of you that haven't watched my previous videos on 999 and Virtue's Last Reward, Zero Escape games are very text-heavy graphic novel adventures. Typically, you might spend over an hour just reading text, and occasionally you'll find puzzle rooms that test your pretty much every form of logic you can think of, just to make sure that there's some gameplay in there. And then there's usually a handful of decisions you can make that influence the way that the game will end. So, as far as the technology in this game, like, is it visually a step up from Virtue's Last Reward? Well, that really depends on your perspective, because each game has had its own unique visual style. The first game was mostly just like pictures, cardboard cutouts of the characters, and a lot of detail describing like what the characters were, what facial expressions they had, what the room was like. Virtue's Last Reward had animated CGI characters, but they mostly just had recycled animations, and they kind of stood in place. Like if you've ever played the Professor Layton games, kind of like that. Now, this game was the first to have actual cinematics. Like during the novel sections, every action, you can actually see the characters moving around, they gesture, they actually walk. And it's fully voiced, too. You know me, I'm a stickler for voice acting in video games after playing Zelda games for far too long and being like, yes! Voice acting in Breath of the Wild. Anyway, off topic. Generally, I found the voice acting to be pretty good in this game. There were only a handful of times where I thought the actor or actress could have done better. I think Axis probably figured, this is the final game, so we really want to step it up a notch after the mixed results in Virtue's Last Reward. Now, from a gameplay perspective, does this hold up? And quite honestly, for the most part, I'd have to say no, unfortunately. One of my biggest complaints that I had about Virtue's Last Reward was that I really didn't like how the game had a hard time registering my stylus taps. During the novel sections, that wasn't a problem, because I basically just had to push the A button to move the text like 20,000 times. But whenever I got to a puzzle room, there might have been something as simple as opening a drawer that would take over an hour to do because it wouldn't register my stylus taps. And at first I thought maybe my 3DS was busted, or maybe I have to adjust the calibration. But then I heard that people playing this game on like the PC and Vita had the same issues. And then it was even worse when I played this. There were, I kid you not, several puzzle rooms where the solution was as simple as opening a drawer or like looking on a shelf to pick up something. And the game would not, for the life of me, register that I wanted to do that. They'd always think I was tapping on something else. Heck, there were a few times where I wanted to examine, well, I won't spoil it for you, but let's just say there was something else I wanted to examine, and the game took like something that was here and said I actually examined something over here. What? Really? Not to mention that there are quite a few gameplay sections where some of the conditions for requiring you to progress in the storyline aren't even properly explained. For instance, the executions after the votes, because I'm not going to divulge much story details, because that's the best part of a Zero Escape game, is reading the story. Don't let anyone spoil it for you. Make sure you get all of the execution scenes, because if you don't, this game is messed up. You won't be able to proceed because of some unknown reason that the game is not telling you. Plus, some of these puzzles are infuriatingly hard, and unlike Virtue's Last Reward, where if you were stuck enough, you'd get more and more hints, and eventually they'd just give away the answer, There's nothing to be found like this in this game. You might be lucky enough to even get one hint on a puzzle. There was one cube puzzle where I wasn't even told what I had to do. They were just like, solve this. And I was like, okay, sure, whatever. And I'm not ashamed to admit, there were quite a lot of instances where I had to look online to figure out what to do next, which was never a problem in Virtue's Last Reward. Thanks to the flowchart, never once did I struggle to get any of the game's 24 endings. But in this game, there were quite a few times where I was like, what else can I do? Every other path is locked. What conditions am I failing to meet? So, in other words, concepts that worked great in Virtue's Last Reward, somehow they just unworked great when making this game. But, on the other hand, I can't bring myself to hate it. As much as this game just frustrates the heck out of me, it's also one of my favorite 3DS games at the same time. And while that may seem like a contradiction, one of the main reasons why I consider this game to be well worth it, and heck, I beat it 2 days after pre-ordering it, that's how much I loved it, is the story. I could not get enough of the story. Now granted, Axis did say in an interview that they intentionally made the game very newbie-friendly, in case this happens to be your first Zero Escape game. In my case, I did play the games in the order they were released, so I got all the references, and was like, oh, so that's why this happened, or that explains this character's wording in that other game. So there's a lot of closure for fans like me that felt like the other games left a lot to the imagination. Or like, okay, so what did happen to this character by the end of 999? Or where did this character get this thing? And pretty much everything is explained. I almost feel like there are pretty much no mysteries left in the Zero Escape universe. And that's how trilogies are supposed to be. Not to mention that the game continues the Zero Escape trademark of bringing up really complex topics. Like, for instance, in this game, they talk about, they reference Back to the Future when they're talking about, consciousness shifting. They talk about the Monty Hall problem. There's talks about, they even mention God by his name. I'll get to that in my Catholic review. But yeah, this game really, really, really gets you thinking. There's so many times when the game blurs the line between reality and fiction that at times you almost forget that you're playing a game and you wonder, do they actually have a point? Is this really how life is going to turn out? And should we really be acting like these characters do? Which brings me to perhaps the biggest part of the gameplay that wasn't a deal breaker for me, and that was what's called the decision game. Which, because having 3 nonary games is kind of overkill, so they decided not to have a 4th. For those of you that are new to the Zero Escape series, there was a nonary game that came before the first one in 999, so they didn't want to have a 4th one, so they called it the decision game, even though the rules are pretty similar to what you'd expect. But what makes this game different than, say, the nonary game in the previous game, is that in that game you had the ally versus betray concept. This time you have several choices that you can make, and a lot of them are a lot more complex than that. For instance, there's one scenario where you decide whether you want to pull a trigger or not, and you don't know whether the gun you're holding is holding a blank or an actual bullet, and the gun is positioned in a way that you can't move it out of the way. It just happens to be in range of one of your friends who happens to be trapped in a position where he can't get out of the way. Decisions like that. There's decisions about, say, when someone asks you a question and says, all right, tell me who did this, and then you'll have to enter a name. And then if you don't answer some of the questions in time, then that in itself will be a decision. So there's a lot of choices you make. And of all the Zero Escape games, this game really brings choice to the forefront. They often make references like, your choice is made. So on one hand, you feel a sense of responsibility way more than you normally would. But on the other hand, as awesome as the flowchart was in Virtue's Last Reward, it also sort of takes away the tension that other games that heavily involved decisions might have had. Because you can always go back and see what the alternate outcome would have been. So let's say your best friend dies in one path because of a decision you make. You feel horrible about it. And in most games, you just have to deal with it. You'd have to stomach your feelings and get your way through the rest of the game. But in this game, it's actually, most of the time, it's actually a requirement to figure out what the alternative would have been. Admittedly, there are some that are kind of like, oh, that's it. But most of the time, yeah, there are some amazing endings. So obviously I'm not going to explain why I love the storyline so much, because that would, again, defeat the purpose of you playing this. But suffice to say that it brings a lot of closure, like a lot of things come full circle. It has a great story standing on its own. It does a surprising amount of character development for the characters that have only appeared in this game. And the characters that have appeared in other games, even if you thought you knew everything there was to know about them, all of a sudden you're learning more and seeing things in a whole new light. And it's just really cool. Also, I like the fact that characters that you pretty much thought were going to, characters that you thought were going down the road you didn't want to, basically the Apollo Justice Syndrome as I call it. Watch my Apollo Justice Phoenix's Downfall video so I don't have to explain it. There were a few characters like that in Virtue's Last Reward that thankfully don't get that treatment in this game. So that's another reason why I felt really satisfied. So, graphically speaking, it's not impressive. I mean, I do appreciate how there's actual cinematics, but the characters, pretty much the only thing that ever moves is, like, their mouth. Their facial expressions mostly stay the same through the whole game. Like, for instance, one of the characters always looks like he's tired. Even when he's, like, about to be angry at someone, he still looks like he hasn't slept in weeks. There's another character that has her hair in a consistent ponytail the entire game. Even in certain instances where she's, like, covered in blood or has been laying down for so long, her hair still stays exactly the same. There's also the fact that, like, characters that are, around for a long time, their hair never grows. They don't get facial hair or leg hair or anything like that. It's just, my suspension of disbelief is often pretty high playing the Zero Escape games, but this game just pushes me overboard. Especially in a game where they were so ambitious as to have cinematics. Also, despite this being a 3DS title, this does not support stereoscopic 3D. Unless my 3DS is busted, but it works on other software, so. I guess Axis figured, our games have always been about the story, not the visuals, so we're not going to go all out and trying to incorporate 3D graphics into this game. And that's probably a good thing, because it's rated M. There's a lot of blood spray. And I mean a lot of blood spray. This is a violent game. And even though they never actually show the moment of a character's death, they will often show the blood spraying from the wound. And they will often show what the character looks like as they're about to die. So if you're one of the faint of heart types of people, the one that's easily squeamish, but thought you could handle it in the previous games because they just described it, this game takes things to another level. Be prepared. But on the other hand, this also isn't a Resident Evil, so if you're thinking thoughts like that, you can be rest assured that most of the deaths are not nearly as brutal as, like, those kind of games. So, my ultimate verdict, feeling kind of in a Phoenix Wright mood right now, my ultimate verdict is that this is definitely a game worth playing, but it's a game that you have to really push yourself to play it. But if you just look at it from a narrative standpoint, it's a pretty much flawless experience that you'll end up not wanting to put your 3DS or Vita, whatever system you play it on. You won't want to end up putting your system down because you're always like, what happens next? What's going to happen to this character? Oh, so that's how this ties into Virtue's Last Reward? Yeah. Not too many games have that much exhilaration, but this game manages to do it. And, spoiler alert, it's not a latent plot. So you can be happy about that too. So thank you very much for listening to me talking about one of my latest obsessions in the 3DS library. And now just hope that the next Zelda managed to be just as good. So farewell to the Zero Escape series. Thank you so much, Axis, for giving us Americans what we really want. Thank you to whoever supported the series that made it possible for Virtue's Last Reward to have even been made. And until my next video, as I always say, keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless.